3, 2, 1, you are now recording.
Oh, hey everybody, and welcome to another amazing Agile Expertise meetup event. And really happy and excited to be here this evening with my partner in crime, Chantal. Hey, Chantal.
Hi.
And really also excited to be hosting Lisa Cooney. With her amazing talk, Agile 2, the Next Iteration of Agile. So Lisa, welcome to our meetup group. It is great to have you. And I'm going to do a quick intro about Lisa and share that for the community as everybody sits back and relax. So Lisa currently serves as the Agile Coach at the new media company Axios. She is co-author of the book Agile 2, the Next Iteration of Agile, and the editor of Evolvagility, Growing an Agile Leadership Culture from the Inside Out by Michael Hamman. Lisa helps organize the DC Women in Agile meetup group, which you mentioned to Chantal and myself earlier, is on the program committee for the Business Agility Institute's conferences in New York City, and speaks at meetups like this and conferences about Agile 2, cognitive bias, and developmental feedback. Lisa, it's an absolute pleasure to have you following on from the amazing event we had with Cliff a few weeks ago. Welcome to Agile Expertise. And without further ado, we'll hand straight over to you.
All right, well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And I hope I can live up to all the hype from Cliff's talk. So for those of you who may not have seen or attended that, Cliff gave a talk on why Agile needs a hard pivot and the case for Agile 2. And in that, I think Cliff reviewed, some of the problems that those of us who've been practicing Agile for a while are familiar with, talked about some of the pain points that we all see in our coaching experiences, and explained why we need to really take a hard look at Agile and pivot in a new direction. And my talk today is going to be oriented towards explaining what Agile 2 actually is, sharing a little bit about the background of how we came up with it, and then talking a little bit about the values and principles. But I would like to invite you to ask questions as we go along. And one of the first things I would like to do is make sure you have access to the slide deck. Have you been able to share that yet?
We will put it into the chat. I will drop the version of the file you shared earlier into the chat imminently.
Excellent. Okay.
With the community, and then everybody will have access to it. It is dropping in. Hang on, it's going to go to the wrong person. It's just going to go to Chantal, so I just need to give it to everybody, and there we go. So it's into the chat now. There we go. The file is uploaded for everybody to download.
Okay, great. So feel free to open that up if you want to. You don't have to. Click around. There's some links in there. If you see something that you're curious about and you have questions on, please either raise your hand or speak right up or put a note in the chat. So I invite you to explore on your own if you wish to, or, we can follow along. Now you can all see my screen, right, that I'm sharing?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so these are some resources that you can explore later on your own. I just like to make them available up front in case you want to click around. And you might find something through some of these resources that you have a question about, and you're welcome to go ahead and ask that question here, or like I said, just interrupt me or put it in the chat. But we have a website called agile2.net. And at this site, we sort of pull back the curtain and explain the thought process that went into creating the book. The book is not exactly the same as the website. So if you're really curious, you may want to explore both, but there is an awful lot of material on the agile2.net site to give you some perspective on the thought process. And then we have a LinkedIn group where we hope that if you're interested in this and you have feedback, you would like to debate something, you question something, go ahead and chime into the conversation there on the LinkedIn group. And then, here's a link to the book and a link to Cliff's talk that he gave in this same meetup recently. These are the folks who put together the set of ideas, the Agile 2 values and principles. We first got together about a year ago and started having conversations with each other, mostly in writing asynchronously, talking about what we saw that was causing pain for us in our work as Agile coaches. And not just as Agile coaches, though, because some of the people in our group are not Agile coaches. We had a range of different expertise that participated in the conversation, but these are all people who work with Agile every day in one way or another, right? So whether they're product designers or they're into data science experts, Lakshmi is HR, people operations, but they all work in an Agile manner and interface routinely with Agile teams and have experienced the pain and the frustrations of various Agile implementations. And through the course of their deep experience, came up with ways of working that were effective and that were successful for them. And so really what we did was have conversations around various topics, like, have you ever seen this type of problem occur? And if you did, what did you do to fix it? How did you handle it? And we went back and forth and back and forth. And at a certain point, it sort of converged on a way of thinking about that. And at that point, we started to document everything. Really, Cliff collected everything and did the hard work of putting it all on Google Docs that we were also collaboratively shared, so that then we would go into those documents and read and comment and discuss and debate. And this went on for quite some time, for about 8 months. And there were days when there were probably 30 or 40 emails back and forth on this. And so what the ideas in the book represent is the collective wisdom of a fairly diverse, fairly large group of experienced practitioners. And it really doesn't represent the ideas of any one person. The goal really was for us to come to consensus about what we felt were the things that were holding Agile back from bringing its true and best value to the organizations that were trying to implement it. I think we've probably all heard variations of the theme that all Agile transformations fail. I don't believe that personally, but you hear these things. People say, oh, it doesn't work. They get frustrated, right? And, as an Agilist who's pretty passionate about Agile and really loves this and is very, very committed to its success and this way of working, it always kind of breaks my heart a little bit when I hear that negativity. And at the same time, I have seen myself some of the challenges that come across when people are trying to implement Agile or undertake a large scale transformation, or I bump into somebody at a cocktail party who is a senior engineer who is in an organization that's just implemented SAFe. And, they tell me all the reasons why they're struggling. And so I think turning away from those pain points and ignoring them isn't going to serve anyone. And so what this collected group of people did was think about, well, what can we bring that's positive? What ideas do we have and ways of thinking about things can we bring to this conversation in order to ensure that Agile continues to bring its power and depth to organizations, and that it doesn't get treated like, I'm sure you've all heard this too, Agile is going to go away. It's just the latest fad and there's going to be this next new thing. But nobody's really sure what the next new thing is. And I was hearing this a few years ago, and then we had the pandemic, and then it felt like a lot of things we always believed were true were no longer true anymore. And people are looking for ways to improve how they work together. And what we're trying to offer here in the book and the website and all of our activities is a way of thinking about how to approach Agile and implementing it that we feel in our experience can be successful. So let me just say a few words around the Agile values that we came up with. You know what, before I do that, let me just pause for a second. Does anyone have any questions or any thoughts they'd like to share about what I've said so far?
Yeah, I guess I do. One thing that's always troubled me, and I think a bunch of people here too, is the term transformation. Everyone I talk to has a problem with that term, not only the Agile community, but also a lot of CEOs, executive groups. And I was wondering if there's any possibility that Agile 2 could address that term.
Well, I think that the way we approach that and many other thorny issues of language, like, is it a practice? Is it a technique? Is it an approach? Is it a method? You know, are we changing, or are we transforming, or are we improving? What we strive to do in our materials and the book is to use the language that is appropriate for the unique context and circumstances of the organization. So it's hard to say, for example, if you're talking with someone who's in a 6-person startup. We all have friends probably who are engineers or various roles, or CEOs or founders of little startups. And they've only been in operation for about 3 or 4 months, and they're kind of struggling and they want to implement some Agile practices. It's kind of odd to talk about that as an Agile transformation, right? So whereas if you're a large company, 5,000 or 6,000 people, you have 1,000 engineers, and you've always operated in a more or less waterfall manner, and you've decided we really want to shift to new ways of doing things. We want to bring about a completely new approach to how we build software. It approaches appropriate language to talk about a transformation. However, I think that word needs to come from the organization itself and not necessarily be imposed by people who are trying to support the organization and going in the direction they want to go. So if they themselves talk about, you know, we want to change and transform ourselves, fine. But I think where it can become a little thorny is when an outside group of consultants comes in and says, we're going to bring about an Agile transformation in your company. And then the question is, well, what does that mean? Like, what does that even mean?
So I do like that. I appreciate the last point is letting them drive the language, really, because it's actually never meant anything to me, to tell you the truth. So it's nice to have these discussions. So I appreciate that last point. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Could I just a quick point? I also think that's also related to the culture of the organization you're seeking to support, right? So coming in with any external language is maybe not always the best and can be actually detrimental. Actually, you need to understand their culture, because you have to engage with them at their level in order to take them on the journey.
Precisely. And, you know, my background is partially in instructional design and corporate training and adult learning theory and that kind of thing. And we were taught and think a lot about jargon and how off-putting jargon can be, and how important it is when you use keywords that sometimes you do need to have a keyword. Like if you, for example, you're working with a group and you think a Kanban board might be useful, it's probably easier to just call it a Kanban board and explain what that is than not. So every once in a while, you might need to use a word, but to be very clear and careful about defining it, and not assume that others will understand it. And when possible, to choose to use language that is everyday. So for example, instead of saying we need to have a sprint planning meeting, you just say, you know, let's sit down and talk about what we're going to do in the next couple of weeks. Same difference, right? If they've never done it before, right? So yeah, I agree with you about the language. Well, I'm going to go on a little bit and talk a little bit about the values. Should say, well, Agile values, and then I'll explain the difference between the original Agile values and the Agile 2 values. So in the original Agile Manifesto, there was a very clear acknowledgement of balance, right? The caveat, the all-important caveat says there's value in the items on the right. So that means there's not just value in documentation, there's value in comprehensive documentation. When we have to choose between them and when we're trying to make decisions, we value working software more. But that doesn't mean we don't value comprehensive documentation ever, right? And so what happens is when people in the Agile community are thinking about these values, they very often forget about the caveat and they focus on the word over. And they take that to mean we value this and we do not value that. And so, for example, when you see external groups decide that they're going to create their own set of unique values, because of the way we tend to visualize it on the left with sort of an either or, this is better than that. When people create manifestos and different types of value statements, they carry that thinking over and they create, like in this case, there's a marketing manifesto and a personal agility manifesto, which are fairly clearly oriented towards good, bad, right? Versus because they've left out the caveat. And I see Matt has his hand up.
Yeah, I completely agree with the whole try and avoid jargon if you can. It can be hard. Like if you're talking to other people who aren't, like, I think sometimes Agile with normal people has a bit of a bad reputation for being, yes, we want to update all the software on your phone every 2 weeks, or I think pisses people off, to be honest. You know, do we need to have a new Google Maps every 2 weeks? Probably not. Yes, but if you start talking about like the concepts in a sensible way, then the concepts are all really good. Like, hey, we shouldn't change the world at once. We should change incrementally and learn from what we go and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's what I would say.
So if we think about this now, it's not new. I found this, the Dark Manifesto, I think it was at one of the talks, Cliff, that you or I gave in February at the Agile 20 Reflect Festival. And someone posted a link to the Dark Manifesto. And that came out in 2012. So what we're saying about this challenge with the misunderstanding of the Agile values is not a new idea. In fact, very little of what we have come up with is brand new. What we have tried to do is articulate it, gather it, and collect it and present it in a coherent and cohesive manner. But there are examples of others who have noticed these same kinds of things. So in our values, what we did was we thought about it in terms of a polarity. So for those of you who may not be familiar with polarity thinking, the idea here is that in a polarity, you have two things that seem like they're opposite, right? But you actually, in real life, you swing between them because one isn't good or bad, right? Sometimes you need action. If you're an individual human, this is a very simplistic example, but and so you're active and you're running around and you're doing all kinds of things, and then you get tired and you can't keep doing that anymore. So you need to rest, and then you rest for a while, and then you've had enough rest, and now you feel restless and bored, and you want to go out and have action, right? So the idea of polarity thinking is that we swing. Sometimes we swing back and forth between two things that are like magnetic poles, but they're not necessarily in and of themselves right or wrong, better or worse, good or not. They're appropriate at different points in time. And so that's exactly what was in the original Agile Manifesto that gets forgotten, is that these statements of this over that are really, in my view, they're polarities, right? And in the original manifesto did acknowledge that, processes and tools may not be more important than individuals and interactions, but I can tell you when you're working with a development team and their tool has broken completely and they can't do their work, suddenly for a few minutes, the tool is the most important thing, and getting that tool fixed and making sure, or maybe replacing the tool and making sure everybody knows how to use it for a period of time, that does become the most important thing. So, you know, and that's okay, because we go back and forth, right? So when we were developing the value statements, we decided intentionally to take a both and approach, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, borrowed from improvisational theater, the idea that all of these things are important and are valuable and are useful depending on the context and depending on the unique situation that you or your organization or the people you're working with find yourselves in. So these are the things that we value. So for the first one, an example here is prescription, which very often in the Agile space has a sort of unpleasant association with it. I have worked with young teams of engineers who recently graduated from college, and while they learned a lot about computer science and programming, and they're incredibly brilliant young people, they've never worked in an Agile manner, and they've never been on a development team, and they've never interfaced with clients and so forth, and they just don't have experience. And so for that kind of a team, some level of prescription is helpful, because if you just tell them use Scrum, they're like, what's that? I've never heard of that before, you know? And so you need to give them some guidance, some suggestions of how to get going. At the same time, you know, you might be dealing with a team that has a real mixture of senior and junior people, in which case making one of the very senior experienced engineers the tech lead might be the appropriate thing for that particular team. And maybe a little bit of prescription, but in conjunction and conversation with the tech lead and the more experienced people, you might craft something that's going to work well for that unique team. So ideally, you have a balance. You don't completely throw away the concept of prescription and never, ever do it. But when it's necessary or needed, you support the idea of being a little bit prescriptive in order to give the adequate level of support for the groups that you're working with. Same thing with outcomes and outputs, which are often discussed as being like the opposite ends of a spectrum. And in Agile 2, we talk about how you can't have outcomes without outputs. So the outputs are kind of a necessary part of the process of getting to good outcomes. And so they're both important, and so at various points in time, one might be more important than the other. But again, if you ignore outputs and say we're only going to focus on outcomes, then the question is, well, how do we get the outcomes we seek? Well, usually it's by somewhat detailed focus on some of the outputs in order to get to where you want to go. Does anyone have any comments or questions about anything I've said so far? I haven't been monitoring the chat, so I don't know.
David's got his hand up.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
I think the first one is somewhat similar to what you're saying about the first values. Prescription is such an open-ended term that you're kind of going back to older values where your management can look at that and say, woohoo, I can do all these rules again. What wonderful. That to me is not a very good term to use here. So that's my 2 cents, and I'd like you to make me feel safe using that word.
Well, I hear what you're saying. I'm curious, is there a word you would prefer that would capture the general concept here?
Oh, you've got me on the spot now. I have to think about it.
I mean, I can think of some, but I'm more curious what you have to say.
Well, it's like the difference between project and product, right? Product is very specific. Project is, you can do anything. You can throw anything into that. So I'd have to, if anyone else has a thought here, but I'd have to shake my brain to get that, because it's way too open-ended for me anyway.
Yeah. Well,
let me think about it.
Yeah, one of the reasons we put so much of the Agile2.net materials are in the Creative Commons, and we have this open LinkedIn page, is that we don't make the claim that everything we've said is true and right and best and final. We did our best to articulate very complex and lengthy conversations on all of these topics. But we know that, they may run into the need for evolution over time. I think, Agile needs to evolve. Funny thing.
Well, Peter Hyde just put one, guidance is that's a very nice word, very simple, but it has more of a specificity to it than prescription. But I know what you're trying to say, because really, let's just say using Scrum or even Kanban, there is a prescriptive method there that should be followed if you want to be successful. But I do like the term guidance. Thank you, Peter.
Peter's even added in recommendations as another one into the chat as well. Proven practices. But we can't stop Peter now. He's coming up with all of them now. This is all. Thanks, Peter.
Oh, Peter, go away.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think those are very good words.
I see a couple people with their hands up. I think Alkesh was
yes, Lisa. I love what you're doing with this, by the way. My thought is that 20 odd years ago, when this thing was put together, the first manifesto, I wonder if they deliberately kind of had to say the word over and try and get people to move away from what was holding people back. So all the things on the left. I mean, they did put that line at the top that says, while we still value the things on the left, etc. But I wonder if that's the problem here, is that people are taking it very literally, and now time's moved on, and we've realised that actually we've gone too far to the right. What do you think?
I agree with you. I mean, I think I won't risk repeating Cliff's points from his talk, but the original Agile Manifesto served a very important need at the time that it was written, and evolved thinking in the field of software development in super important ways. And all of us involved in Agile 2 really love Agile generally, and are really passionate about the power of its ability to help people work together more effectively and all those things. But at the same time, like you said, things do shift and evolve and change. And I went to a talk by Mary Poppendick, who just said, look, in the software world, anything that's 20 years old is outdated. So the idea of doing something now, just because the Agile Manifesto said something 20 years ago, come on, what are we doing? We need to think for ourselves and respond to the world we find ourselves in at the moment. And so Agile 2 really is our attempt to articulate our agreement on what we think is important for 2021. And at the same time, maintain a deep respect and appreciation for all that has come before. We don't want to throw away all that's wonderful. Like, Peter mentioned proven practices, recommendations. There is so much collective knowledge and wisdom on all those things that we need to keep that. We need to retain what is working well, and have the awareness that, what's going to work well in one situation might not work well in another, and to be able to use our judgment. So I see also, I'm sure I'm going to pronounce your name wrong, Obafemi.
Can I just Lisa, can I just address that? Just one thought I did have is the problem with language like this, especially international, is that people have different understandings of this stuff. And I think what I really love about Agile is, as we move further away from practices and move towards more of a mindset of why we're doing this, what's the purpose, what's the benefit, and how you might get there, then the language kind of goes away a little bit, because everybody in their own cultures and the way that they're working will lead to the same purpose and goal of what Agile is meant to be about. So I think sometimes we get hung up too much on language, and we do have to consider an international and diverse cultural audience.
Mm-hmm.
I'll shut up now.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. That was pretty close pronunciation, but feel free to call me what colleagues like Giles call me, which is Shock, shortened version of my surname, whichever you find easiest. So it's absolutely fine. So I just want to make a couple of points to what I thought was a great question. And it's around sort of semantics. Well, first, transparency. I don't come from a software development background. I work in healthcare, and so digital healthcare consulting is what I do. So it's a lot of complexity and about change. So prescription. There are times, and this comes from contingency theory of leadership. So there are times when the appropriate action is quite directive, quite prescriptive. And if you think about the Stacy matrix, when you're in chaos, there's not, it's not a case of guide or consensus or whatever. So I'm not particular about the word, but it does need to be a word. And as we're saying, it depends on cultures and language, that is really quite clear, which is quite directive. If there's a fire, you need some order, etc., to move it from your sort of chaotic state into a more situation where you can start to look at managing the complexity. So that would be my sort of first comment. And then in a wider sense, it's like a pendulum. Essentially, of course, maybe, originally that was, to counter what was a big issue in terms of the original manifesto. And then, of course, it's to create that momentum and make it swing. Now, our role, I think, as leaders or thought leaders within this space is to understand and kind of guide that pendulum swinging. And it's always going to be some motion, but the less extreme. And maybe what's happened is it's gone from coming through and needing to address the status quo. It's past the middle and is now going in a different direction. And we must let it get back to, the equivalent on the other side and try and keep the motion somewhere around that sort of equilibrium, but still in motion. Those are my sort of 2 pennies worth to the comments. Thank you.
Thank you for those thoughts. I agree with you completely. And one of the words that I use a lot to describe Agile too is balance. This concept of getting away from thinking of responses to really difficult problems with specific step-by-step solutions or best practices or what could on paper seem to be easy answers, and getting back to judgment, thinking deeply from a philosophical point of view, and getting things back into balance. So like several of these are about balance, like individual empowerment and good leadership. And this value speaks to the challenge of self-organizing teams and autonomy, which are wonderful when teams are ready for them. When teams are less experienced and aren't prepared for that level of autonomy, they can lead to some really poor outcomes when teams are given either way too much autonomy or told, go ahead and self-organize, but they don't have the skill set or the knowledge to be capable of doing that. And so it's a question not so much of a certain type of leadership is always good in every situation, but given a unique scenario that you find yourself in, out of all the different types of leadership styles and approaches, what is going to work the best? So I love your story about, when there's a fire, you need somebody just barking out orders and everybody, you don't have time to get consensus. You just have to make decisions and move forward. And so being able to think about the complexity of these scenarios is part of what we're inviting people to do. And the challenge of trying to do that is that in doing so, you're not really giving folks answers. You're not really giving them a framework and saying, if you have this problem, this is the solution. And people like to get answers. I'm sure we've all been in situations where you've come in to support or coach or guide, and you start investigating what's actually happening, and more or less people are saying to you, just tell me what to do. Just what's the fix? Like on day 2, they're saying to you, what's the best practice? What do we need to implement? And you're thinking, well, I don't really even know what you're struggling with yet. So I'm not sure, out of the dozens of best practices I could pull out of my back pocket, I'm not sure right now which one is appropriate. And knowing full well that if you try to implement the wrong one, it's going to make things worse and not better. So what we try to do with these values is emphasize the need for balance between them. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward a little bit onto some of the principles, unless anyone else has something else they'd like to raise. I don't see any hands up.
Hi, Lisa, it's Ital.
Hi.
I do one as well so people could see me. Yeah, so this is really interesting. I think one thing that I always feel is missing, but it is something that does come to the surface in the Agile world and in the space, is pragmatism.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, being completely real and honest and pragmatic about the current circumstances to then initiate and push for a change. It feels like that's never, well, I mean, correct me if I'm saying the word never, but it seems to be, you know, overlooked in many ways.
Mm-hmm. You know, I have more than once come into engagements and gotten a sense of what was going on and made some suggestions and had people come up to me and say, that's not very agile. I don't know why you're doing that. That, you know, that doesn't follow the Scrum guide. And then I need to, you know, sit down with them and explain, well, we're in a very complex contracting situation where we have 3 layers of contracting and external groups that over which we have no control that we must interface with daily. We have imposed upon us certain types of tools and legacy systems we're trying to modernize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So given our scenario, let's be real. How are we going to accomplish our goals? Yeah. If that violates one of the rules of Scrum or some other Agile rule according to that person's understanding of what Agile is, you know, so be it. I'm okay with that because what we're trying to drive here towards is success, right? And accomplishment. We're not trying to be the perfect Scrum team or the perfect Agile anything. We're trying to get real hard stuff done. And in order to do that, we need to adjust and adapt to our circumstances. And, you know, fearing that you'll be called out by the Scrum police or the Agile police, in my opinion, should not be part of the conversation when you're trying to figure out how to support people who are doing really hard things.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, being very kind of real about these things actually helps drive that success in a more confident way, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
You're welcome. Okay, so principles. And again, stop me if you have something to say, a question, a thought. There are a lot of principles. There are 43 of them. And we discussed and debated them for a long time, the 8 months. And my hunch, Cliff, forgive me for saying this, is that they will not stay exactly the way they're now. Because life is a learning journey and our language may not be perfect and who knows. But what I can say is that every single one of the 15 people involved in this effort stands behind each one of these principles. We discuss them at such depth and length that we all really believe each of these statements and feel confident about saying, you know, we can put our name behind what we think is really important here. It doesn't mean there aren't things missing that individuals of us might have wanted to add to the list. Some of us may have wanted to wordsmith little parts of these a little bit, but fundamentally we're in really tight agreement. So they're in 10 general categories. And I, you know, obviously I can't speak to 43 of them in a short time. So what I'll do is just call out 1 or 2 per slide and then invite you to go explore more about this on your own or, you know, ask questions here about something that jumps out at you. Personally, this is one of my favorite because 1.2 says any significant transformation is mostly a learning journey. As a learning expert and having spent a lot of my career focusing on how people learn, in the process, reading a lot about cognitive science and theories of memory, theories of mind, how do we know that we know something? How do we know that somebody else knows something? How do we ensure that our knowledge is, quote unquote, true versus just a belief? I think all of life is a learning journey, but certainly when an organization decides to change how they work together, whether you use transformation or you use a different word to describe it, mostly it's about people's brains, how they think, what they feel, their brains and their hearts, and maybe their guts too, right? And it's about helping when we as consultants or working in the organization are trying to be supportive of this. As we all know, it's about supporting that human journey and the human learning that needs to happen along the way, the hearts and minds that brings about the change. It's not about, as we all know probably really well, it's not about just implementing a process. And I see someone raise their hand.
Sorry, it's me again.
Hi.
Actually, I just sort of saw 1.3, change must come from the top. I understand what you're trying to say, but I've seen many places where change does come from the weeds, from the bottom. So that one's a little obviously up to interpretation, I guess.
Yeah, I think where that, the spirit behind that one is that if the top level leadership is intransient and unwilling to be open-minded and think differently, it's very difficult for change that comes from the bottom to ultimately prevail. And that's just, the majority of us have had that experience. And I think that's what we're trying to address here is when those in power, like the owners of a company or the CEOs or the founders of a startup are strongly opposed to something and unwilling to yield. And whatever it is you're trying to change can't be successful. Now, what can happen, and I've seen this happen, I'm sure many of you have as well, where change comes from the bottom and the leadership says, oh, wow, okay, we need to think about this. We need to, I want to learn, and then they go with it, right? And they're open-minded and they, can change and adapt. It's just, maybe it's partly because I've spent a good part of my career working in enormous United States federal agencies where change from the bottom is almost impossible. Not impossible, but when leadership is on board, things tend to go more smoothly. So that's sort of the context for that.
Yeah, it seems like it would be a good selling point when you introduce yourself to a company, to the C team, as it were, that this must come from you. But I'm not sure if it, in its current form, I'm not sure if it belongs in here. You did say a sentence right at the beginning, and of course I took the word ultimately, which I thought it was great, but it's very directive, or it was specific about the top, and unfortunately, hopefully we can go back to the recording and hear what that sentence was, because I thought it applied here.
Yeah, maybe it does. Well, I see some notes from Peter, leadership at all levels. And this is definitely, in fact, there's a whole, I'm going to jump ahead. Let's see. Cliff, maybe you remember which one of these is about leadership, but that's the last one, I think. We talk at length about leadership, and I completely agree about leadership at all levels. Michael Hamman used to talk about that as like an everywhere sort of leadership. And the idea is that not only are there all types of leadership styles and approaches, but there's also individuals will, show leadership in various ways at various times within groups, and that we need to foster and support the healthy, beneficial forms of leadership wherever they emerge. And that may not mean necessarily promoting people into positional layers of leadership where they have institutional authority in the organization, but at the same time being supportive of the type of leadership that's emerging and working with individuals to support the kind of leadership that they're providing for a particular team or a particular project. And being able, if you are in a position in an organization of authority and power because you own it or you're the CTO, but that you are willing to create an environment that supports and welcomes other forms of leadership from other people without sort of deeply yourself feeling it as a threat to your own power, or, you know, understanding how it fits in to basically getting the outcomes that you seek, right? Being innovative, being creative, solving problems. All forms of leadership are needed. I'm seeing some nods, heads nodding. Oh, and I see a hand up. Sorry, if I missed something, feel free to jump in.
Right. Lisa, I think that it's a matter of what it is that we're talking about here, because I think, to your point, leadership from the top, it needs to start from the top. I think what we're saying there is there are some structural changes, organizational changes, or enterprise level changes that are going to be needed to make some of this stuff really successful and free up people to think and deliver properly. And in order to do that, you absolutely have to get the buy-in from those people who can make those massive decisions and massive changes. But to the others' points, and everyone on the text, is that change needs to come from, or the innovation needs to come from everywhere, because the people at the coalface, the people doing the work, people in front of the customer, they're the ones who know perhaps what we should be doing and what the feedback is saying that we should be changing and developing and improving. So I think that work needs to come from everywhere, not just fed from the top. So I think it's the question of what it is. If it's organizational structural change, obviously at the top. If it's local decision making to make something better, then they should be empowered to do that at all levels. To Chantal's point of flat structures and things like that. Exactly. I think you said it earlier you said the word balance, and I think, yeah.
One more question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, first thing, I think we're probably taking up too much of your time because I'm guessing you've got a lot to get through. So I might suggest that we might hold some of our questions till the end. But to the point, and this is just kind of a little, again, language semantics, is when you say leaders should hire someone that does the transformative roles. It's absolutely a good point. However, when I look at other teams, they usually hire people, it's kind of the buddy system, right? We hire someone that, hey, is going to follow my path. And now if my path is, yes, I want to implement this, but I don't agree with it, or I don't feel I'm one of those leaders, then I'm going to hire a person that is strengthening my position. So just a semantic issue there. Excuse me.
I think sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, I think each organization is different. I know that it sounds so trite and so easy, but the truth is that in my observation, it's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all statement about what should happen in a particular specific instance. If you have a leader who's already very agile-minded and has an agile mindset and is already very open, what you recommend and suggest might be very different than a place where the leader is interested in it, but would rather have someone else come in and take care of it. And then yet again, that's different from an organization where the leader thinks that the agile implementation you're bringing is something you're going to go do with those people over there and make them deliver software quicker. And that's all I care about is, am I getting my features more quickly? And if I'm not getting my features more quickly, then whatever this agile crap is you're doing, it's failing, right? So
I'm guessing a lot of people have seen that, including me.
Well, and all kinds of permutations and mixed up variations of those. So that's why it's so difficult to say, this is the approach to changing your organization in an agile direction that's going to work. for everyone everywhere, right? It's more about, assessing what's going on in that particular circumstance. And then, experienced Agile practitioner, you all know this already, right? I mean, it's you need to adjust to what's happening. And what we have found is that, these principles have helped us. So I'm going to scoot back. Did I see something else come up?
I think Chantal's hand popped up, but we're about somewhere sort of about 25 minutes left or so. So just wanting to, for everyone's ease here today.
Okay. The other thing I'd like to mention is we've done this more than once, where so many questions came up in the chat that we circled back and answered them in writing later. So that's also, don't refrain from asking a question if you have it. If we don't have time to delve into that topic, we will still try to address all of those. All right, so I'll just talk a little bit about some of these other principles. So this category is self-explanatory, but the idea here is to the idea I'd like to emphasize here is the overall importance of product design. If you speak to designers and product designers in various companies, UX people, they often feel marginalized and sidelined by, I don't know what, right? Well, they'll blame Agile practices or Scrum or something for saying that they're not important, but I'm sure it's much more nuanced and complex than that. But, product design is sort of the core of what we're doing, because no matter what we're involved in, even if our product is a service, however we define the word product, we're trying to do something together. Like when I worked at the US Department of Homeland Security, we were trying to protect the country from attacks. And so, it doesn't matter how you define it, you always have some kind of core thing that you're trying to accomplish, and that's your product. And how you design that, how you think intentionally about what it is that you're going to do is vitally important. And that's something that we really emphasize in our materials, because we think that product discovery, that process of figuring out what's going to work, testing your product early and often, iterative development, trying things out, running experiments, keeping careful track of your experiments, documenting them so that you know what worked and what didn't, and you're not just running a bunch of experiments without collecting the data, which leads me to the next batch of values and principles, which is data. Now, we all know how vitally important data is. And at the time when the Agile Manifesto was written, data may not have been like the key thing that was on everyone's minds. But now we feel like it's really sort of front and center, and being able to gather appropriate data, analyze it appropriately, decide what actions to take on the basis of that data is really important. Complying with data rules and regulations, depending on the country that you live in. This is the first time that I've seen the requirement to actually have to click on something to indicate my approval to be recorded. I kind of like that. In the United States, it's really easy to just say, oh, everybody, by the way, I'm recording, click, can you record? So, paying attention to the nitty gritty of what we collect about people and what we, how we analyze that information is really, really important. And organizations ignore data or minimize it at their peril, as we all know. Another important category for us is this whole concept of frameworks. And I would say roughly what's included here is also ideas about best practices, approaches, techniques, methods, models. One of my favorite quotes is that old saying, all models are wrong, some models are useful. Fit what needs to happen to the circumstances in the organization you're in. And they're, as much as people love recipes, they want step-by-step guidance. It's not, the world doesn't work that way. And we can't really provide people with a recipe or a step-by-step model for what exactly is going to work. until and unless we have enough information and knowledge of their culture, their circumstances, their unique environment, that we, in collaboration with them, have determined that a particular approach might be a good place to start, right? And in that case, we may be going back to our earlier conversation around prescription. We may actually say, you know what, in this particular instance, I think XYZ framework is going to be the most helpful for what you need right now. And then we shift into teaching mode, teach people the framework, work with them side by side, explain to them how to be successful using it and so forth. That might be appropriate. And we're not saying that it's not. It's just that it depends on what that particular organization needs. And we're just not fans of a one size fits all approach. Now this, before I go on, does anybody have anything they want to say or share or ask?
Okay, I'll ask one.
Okay.
The thing about frameworks, I'm not sure how to word this. Would it be nice to get rid of frameworks and choose the practices that actually do work, rather than, again, being prescriptive? Just throwing it out there. It's not a question that really has to be answered now, but it's just something that's on my mind.
As you could imagine, when we put this together, we had a lot of discussion over whether these were frameworks or methodologies, or were they practices or techniques or approaches. Again, it goes back to semantics, right? What is a framework after all? What is a model? What is a method? So I personally am kind of open and holistic when I think about these words. So in 4.1, you could change that to an agile practice, an agile technique, an agile approach. And I would still, feel strongly that this particular principle applied. We decided to use the word framework because of its connotations generally in the agile community and outside of the generally in the tech field, where people think of these things as management frameworks or, process frameworks. It's a well-known word. Does that sort of address what you were?
Not really, but
not really?
Don't worry about it. So long as the first thing you said is, using agile techniques, I think is a good way to put that. So I just thought I
think we lost audio there for a second.
I think we've lost David there.
Oh, too bad. Well, hopefully he'll be able to come back.
Oh, I'm back. Did you want to get rid of me? That was probably Charles, who's probably put me on mute. I talk too much.
Didn't touch a thing.
Thank you.
So this section 5, this category of principles, really gets at the heart of how Cliff and I met in the first place. I came to the conclusion that technical knowledge was a big gap for me personally. I learned computer programming back in college, like a million years ago, and I've worked in IT spaces throughout most of my career, mostly in the training area, but teaching people how to use software and so forth. But I felt that I needed to learn more about DevOps and really understand better about the tech behind what my teams were doing. And Cliff was teaching this class called DevOps for Agile Coaches. And I took it and loved it. And it went on for a year, and it was pretty intense. And it helped me dramatically. And, I think where sometimes business leaders and leaders in organizations that are doing a lot of tech, they delegate responsibility for the tech to others, or they don't feel that it's necessary for them to take the time to to understand at a very high level. Like, by the way, for my DevOps class, I was not taught to be a DevOps engineer, not at all. I was just taught enough to sort of roughly understand the big picture of what was going on. And probably I learned a lot more about DevOps than a business leader would need to know, but I was super curious. But I do think, though, that leaders of organizations, like, it doesn't matter if you're leading a hospital or a law firm or, you know, what type of organization, you need to have enough of an understanding of the tech side of things so that you can have healthy conversations with your tech leaders and make good decisions that are going to help you get the outcomes that you seek and help you move in the right direction. And when you are a technical leader, you have to understand enough of the business to know why it is that you're doing what you're doing. What is the business outcome? What is the need that your tech products is going to fulfill, right? So both sides, yeah, somebody wrote, yeah, you need to know enough so you can't be completely bullshitted. That's about it, right? On both sides, right? So technical folks need to understand enough about the business and what the needs are so that they know the big picture. And technical or business leaders need to understand the tech enough so that when they go to their tech leaders and say, we want to do a thing, and the tech leaders say, well, that thing is impossible because of, you know, whatever limitations, then, you know, they can have an intelligent conversation about how do we shift from impossible to possible and what needs to happen, right? And so both of them need to know and understand one another in order to make that successful. Now, this individuality versus the team, here we're thinking about the way that the Agile community in general focuses so much on the team that sometimes the individual and the individual's needs can get a little lost in there, because when everything is about the team, then individuals' preferences and ways of working and ways of communicating can go by the wayside. And what we try to foster and emphasize in the book and all of our materials is the concept that we need to honor and respect both. We need to think about the team, what's best for the team, what will help the team be effective, achieve their goals, and all of that. But we also need to think about the individuals and how they best communicate with each other and how they work the best, how they can be the most effective, and how the organization as a whole can bring out the best in that individual in terms of innovation, creativity, productivity, all of those things, and respect what they say and ask for. So if, for example, the person is an introvert and they have certain styles of working that work really well for them, the organization needs to respond to that by respecting that and working with them and not trying to force them into behaviors and activities. For example, requiring that everyone always have their video on at every meeting, or that every major decision be an in-person or maybe a Zoom meeting where everyone comes together in live time. Maybe some decisions can be made asynchronously through a written form, right? So we just try to create or describe an environment where we can bring the best out of everyone by respecting diversity and respecting all types of ways of being productive. And I'm seeing some interesting notes. I don't have time to read them in the chat. I welcome anyone to jump in if there's a concept there we'd like to dive into a little more.
I think we need to save tonight's chat. It's been phenomenal.
Yeah.
Find a way of, we'll upload it with your PDF to the OneDrive and share it with those that came along. And obviously anybody can save the chat themselves if they want to, but we'll probably do it and put it up with the PDF.
Okay, great. Thanks. Love it. I love reading those chats and exploring links and other things that people mention. So I'm sure all of you know a lot more about all these things than I do. You know, that's part of the point of Agile too. It's not like we're trying to come along and say, we have a brand new thing and we want to share our brand new thing and explain it all. What we're trying to do here is articulate things that many or most of us already know or have experienced. Oh, and I see Rochelle's hand is up.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to stop your flow at all. But I just want to say fantastic Fantastic, fantastic. Most people that know me know I'm probably a bit of a softie in terms of the humanistic approach. I like the word transformation. I know something about transformations myself, personally. So I'm quite happy with that word. But I think we've all got to transform to the point as individuals for change, I guess, is what you were saying as well. But this is so fantastic. I just wanted to relay something that kind of brought those two things together, just as an example recently that I came across, which was we wanted to do something good for the team, have a start of the sprint kind of ceremony. And I kind of had slight misgivings about it in terms of it could be a bit divisive. Anyway, so the polls go up and everybody gets to vote who they can have as this star of the sprint award. And you see some people get 0%, and I'm starting to think, well, wait a second, if you're one of the people that's not getting voted, it starts off as a good thing that you think you're doing for the team, but actually it's quite harmful, I think. And so something for me that I've got some self-awareness from and you're endorsing really from your experiences is you have to look at it holistically, and it includes inclusivity isn't just about race, color, or gender identity or whatever. It's much finer grained than that, I think. So yeah, thank you so much. Really enjoying this. Keep going.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. Yeah, I think it sounds very straightforward. Probably many of us have quite a bit of D&I experience in various places we've worked. And it sounds like a good idea, and it sounds straightforward. And in practice, it's actually challenging, because sometimes in your efforts to be inclusive, you inadvertently, without even realizing it, exclude some people. And you know what? Sometimes there is no way to have everyone feel equally included. And when those things happen, I think the best approach is to just be really honest about it and to be very straightforward and to say, hey, if you're an introvert, we're going to have a party tonight and we're going to do or an extrovert, we're going to have a party tonight and we're going to do the following things. And, it's fine if you feel that you don't really want to participate. Like, we're not going to put a lot of pressure on everyone to have to be there and have to do things a certain way. And so you just try to find ways to articulate your awareness that you're trying to be as inclusive as you can be, but you also are aware that you may sometimes not quite hit the mark that you set for yourself. I think we've all been in situations where everybody's talking a lot about inclusivity, but it doesn't feel like it's actually happening. And so that sort of cognitive dissonance can be a little strange and confusing for folks. So just acknowledging what's that?
Virtue signaling. I've seen that a lot. I think it's well intended. Organization. I mean, I've always felt, the first thing that you start to do is to put people into compartments, LGBTQ plus, and then you've got BAME, and then you've got, gender gaps and so on. And actually, it's about psychological safety for the organization, and something I'm pushing, because if you get that, you've got all the other things anyway, without necessarily having to divide it up. And yeah, perfect. Absolutely agree.
Yeah. Okay, continuous improvement. Here, I've highlighted place limits on things that slow you down, right? Personally, in my own coaching experience, where I've found a biggest challenge is literally just identifying what is slowing us down and convincing, or not convincing, but helping the people that I'm working with to see that this thing is slowing us down, because they may not realize it. They just aren't aware of it. But identifying the things that are slowing us down and keeping us from the outcomes we seek, and then relentlessly addressing them and tackling them is really, really important. And don't fully commit capacity. That's one of my personal favorites, because I'm a big fan of striving to achieve a state of flow and giving people the space and the time and energy space that they need to be really creative and innovative in order to meet the goals you're trying to meet. And the only way I've ever seen that be reliably successful is when there's a little bit of slack in the system. When people feel like on any given day, there's 20 hours of work to do, and they're going to be going flat out for 10 hours straight, no matter what they do, that's when you start to lose people's really their best ideas and their most thoughtful suggestions for how to improve, how to do a better job of achieving whatever it is, or just plain being productive. So we are definitely in favor of not planning out everything and committing all the capacity. And then the last one, I guess this does get to cognitive flow, which is focus, giving people the space that they need. And this is where you'll see Cliff has written some articles. One recently, I particularly liked Cliff about meeting culture and how having a day filled with regularly cadenced meetings, like every week we meet with this group for an hour, and every other week we meet with that group for half an hour. And before you know it, your day, your 8-hour day has 7 hours of meetings or more. And so when are you supposed to get any work done, right? So respecting people's need to focus by being intentional and thoughtful about how you create space for them to accomplish their goals is really, really important. Okay, so I think we have until 3 o'clock. Am I right on that?
Yes, yep, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to stop talking now and see what kinds of things you all are curious about, or maybe you have some stories or ideas of your own you'd like to share with the rest of us.
There's been some fantastic questions in the chat, so if anyone does want to ask them openly, please do feel free to come on cam, come off mute and share your questions.
So just a couple of comment and a question, really. So thanks very much. I think it's a fantastic presentation, and I'm really loving the sort of work and effort and the thinking behind what you've done.
Thank you.
And obviously all of your collaborators as well. So please pass on my respects. So my question is a bit of an internal and an external one. So do you think there is enough that we are doing, the Agilists and the Agile community, in terms of pushing this leadership agenda, i.e. the value that it can create for society? And the reason I'm saying this is that I think there is a level of insularity that we have, that there's an expectation on us, and therefore there's a frustration. So there's a behavioral thing in terms of, well, why can't people get this? This makes sense. And we're not almost being agile about the nature of human beings in society, in organizations, under fear. And it's great having frameworks and principles, etc. But people's reality is not our reality. So the question is, are we doing enough about this leading change, which is looking at ourselves and how we're doing?
I think we're starting to. I mean, the first time I heard cracks in this, I was at the Agile 2018 conference in San Diego. And some folks went to Agile camp for a couple of days before the conference started. And it was mostly leadership from the conference, and a lot of experienced Agile coaches were there. And I started hearing people talk about how Agile was going to be going away. And I was like, what? What do you mean? I love this. It can't go anywhere. It's so amazing. How could it go anywhere, right? Because it's so powerful and so great and so much better. And they said, well, people don't like it. Our clients keep telling us they're frustrated about this or that. They've tried Agile and it didn't work for them, or even it was a disaster for them. They're unhappy. And when you talk to people generally in IT, like software engineers and developers and designers, and you say to them, what do you really think? If they know you well enough and they believe that you're not going to get too defensive, they'll actually tell you, I just hate all this Agile stuff. It just makes my job so much harder. I really, I can't stand it. I've had lots of people tell me that. So then I asked them, well, why? What's going on? Like, what do you think? And then they tell me all their pain points. And I think to myself, we need to listen to that. We can't respond to that by saying, oh, you're not doing it right. Or, oh, you don't know enough, you need more training. Or you need to read this book and then you'll get it and then you can do it. we need to have some other way of addressing those pain points. And one of the things that got me really excited about Agile 2 as we were working our way up towards the publication of the book was how surprised I was by how interested people were in these ideas. And I started speaking about it casually. I love open space conferences. I go to them when I have the opportunity. And I was at one and offered a session on Agile 2. And a couple of times people in that conversation actually said to me, is it okay to say these things? Is it okay to be critical of Agile? And I said, I feel like it's like being critical of your mom when you're talking to your sister. It's like, people aren't perfect. Agile isn't perfect. And if we're going to expand our profession, keep ourselves relevant, keep Agile from going away, whatever that means, we need to learn and grow and evolve. And we need to be honest with each other about the pain points that we either see and experience, or people come and tell us why they hate Agile. We need to think about that and think, well, what do we do? And what we tried to do here in Agile 2 is articulate some core values and principles that we hope and we believe personally, is going to get us moving in the right direction. What we're not really doing is providing a lot of answers or frameworks or, checklists or recipes or anything like that. But we are trying to articulate things that people have been saying. And in others of my open space sessions, people have actually said, it feels a little refreshing to be able to talk about these things openly. And I got the sense that we were far from the only people having these thoughts and ideas. So I think the more we can bring them into the open and then figure out how are we going to tackle these? What in the world are we going to do? And figure it out together, put our minds together as a profession and work on this.
So transparency, inspection, and adaptation, following our own creed, right?
The emperor's got no clothes on. Yeah, it's time to be honest. Yeah, okay. I thought it was just me, but it's everybody. Great.
And I just want to be clear, I love Agile. I'm very passionate about this. I kind of fell in love with it initially when I was asked to create a course on Agile. And I feel like what I'm doing is supporting it and keeping it relevant and vibrant and evolving it in a direction that will be helpful and supportive for others. I don't feel like I'm attacking Agile. Although I know sometimes it comes across that way, because if you say things like, Scrum can have the following negative consequences, people might say, oh, that's attacking Agile. But personally, I feel like I'm more in the camp of, actually, I'm just trying to be honest and do some inspect and adapt here, and be honest about pain points that we see and try to figure out what's going to work well for folks. Because I'm a mom. I have 3 kids. I raised them. My husband traveled a lot. I was very often, raising the kids at home on my own. And you have to be pragmatic. You just have to figure out what's going to work and what's going to be successful. And I retain that general approach. Like, what I want for my teams is to be happy and to get their work done and to feel good about it and get the outcomes that the organization needs. I don't care that they have a stand up a certain way or that they follow certain rules, unless they've talked amongst one another and had agreements with each other and made promises to each other, in which case they need to honor the agreements that they make to each other as humans, right? But it's not because it's in some Scrum guide or some other document. It's because they've promised to each other, this is how we want to do things. And that's when it's important to honor those personal commitments. So as you can see, I keep saying, except in this case, in that context, right? And so all of Agile 2 is kind of like that. We try to take a holistic view and a balanced approach based on context.
We've got a couple of other questions in the last few minutes. So We got Rochelle first, followed by Matt.
Oh, yes, thank you. Just an observation, psychological safety wasn't really a sort of a prominent subject 20 years ago. And you're kind of bringing that in with this kind of humanistic approach and seeing, which is great. I've always had this view that says, I don't care if it's supposed to be 15 minutes, just have a bit of fun in the stand. Most people that have been in one of my stand-ups, I try to get laughter going. And if that's an extra 5 minutes, that bonding time is, I've been known to play my guitar in the middle of a retro and things. Certainly, I call myself a lazy scrum master, because the idea is you go in there, and if it's an inexperienced team, like you're saying, you need to give a lot of support. You need to be in there, and it's mentoring as much as it is coaching. And then you kind of move to coaching, and you become an agile coach. That's a lazy scrum master. What's an agile coach? A lazy scrum master, somebody who's managed. It really doesn't matter whether they're there for the half those ceremonies, except for the retros. And so on. So yeah, absolutely wonderful. And a step-by-step guide, you can give a step-by-step guide. Isn't it something like try something, step 1, try something, step 2, fail, step 3, learn from that, step 4, try again, right? That is the only step-by-step guide we can give these people. But superb talk, absolutely amazing. Thank you guys for arranging it. I'm really going to reach out to you, because kindred spirits, amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Matt, I think we got our last question possibly of today. Matt,
Jesus.
Ask your question.
I suppose the question I've got is, what pain points are software developers having with Agile? I would have thought software developers would probably quite like it, but hey-ho.
Anybody else want to answer? No? Okay.
My developers are not. My developers are definitely not. Trying to get them enthusiastic about Agile. It's an assumption that development teams are passionate about Agile. In fact, I've been surprised about the number of times they're not, but I do want to hear your answer.
I wonder if it's because the pressures they're on of getting stuff out, and the way that they work, and the way, so I think we're talking about business change and what the developers need to develop to be adaptive, to be able to keep changing for the customer, all that kind of stuff. But actually, in a dev team, when they're up against it to just get something out, they probably see some of this stuff as being more interrupting.
Right.
I think I can actually echo that, Alkesh. So with dev teams, they've got objectives to meet, and in some cases, I think one thing teams tend to sort of, when they're non-agile teams and they're formulating an agile way of working, one thing I've seen many teams struggle with is the concept of estimating story points versus estimating in time. Time is still very much front and center of their minds. So with that time pressure to get things done, I think that's where you do get some difficulties.
And again, that's back to the leadership and getting the environment to accept, and there's all those other things that need changing. Sorry, Giles, I think we're out of time.
No, yeah, I think we're just about out of time, and I just wanted to obviously start the wrap up, and I know Chantal and myself both want to give our thanks as well for an amazing event today, wherever you are, whether it's your morning, afternoon, or evening. The levels of engagement, and thank you, Lisa, for allowing the community to jump in with questions throughout. I love the approach, and it was really engaging. Some amazing questions and thought leadership. As I said, the chat was phenomenal today. I'm certainly making sure I'm going to click save right now to make sure it does save at the end. There we go, done. And I just wanted to say big thanks to you, and again, Cliff, great to have you back supporting here again today. Really loved, obviously, your talk last time as well. Chantal, before we wrap up, over to you, please.
Yeah. Oh my God. Just like Cliff's talk, Lisa, you also got my mind ticking to the point that I wanted to butt in a little bit more than I have, but I wanted to step back and let the rest of the community speak. There's a lot of value to be shared. And actually, I really love this second take and this evolution of agile ways of working, because it's doing exactly what I would love to see happen in the workplace, and that is bringing the human back into the workplace. I still think in many organizations that's missing. And I think something like this would certainly encourage the new concept of, actually building psychological safety into a workplace in a way that is truly psychologically safe, not just using them as buzzwords. And I think something like this could potentially really add value from that perspective. And it's certainly something I am going to see how I can incorporate it into my strategies as well. So thank you so much for sharing.
Well, you're welcome. It was an honor to be here. Very happy to do it.
An honor to have you here. And
absolutely, 100%.
Amazing. So everyone, thank you so much for attending. As always, you're a great audience, and we love having you and hosting you here. Our next talk is actually another follow-on. So we've had Cliff, followed on by Lisa, and then the next one, what we're going to be doing is having conversations about psychological safety. So it's an open panel, and we've got some great speakers coming onto the panel. And that we've got Femi, who's actually one of our regulars on Agile Expertise. We've got Pamela Ayodel and the infamous Roy Marriott and Emily Webber. And what we're going to be doing is hosting a panel event to sort of understand the importance of psychological safety and actually expand on that in a bit more detail. So thank you everyone for coming, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all again on the 29th.
And just one last drop in, we have at our other event, we have Alkesh, who's here, who obviously doing a lot on the safe talks, is doing his talk, How Safe is Safe, for his SPC accreditation, I believe. So I have put a link in the chat, so anybody who wants to come along and join Alkesh in discovering how safe actually is safe, then please do feel free. It's this time, same time, next week, next Tuesday. So it'll be great.
Can't resist that one.
I love the idea that it's on Zoom, because I think a lot of rotten fruit will be thrown at me
otherwise.
Yeah,
indeed. I'll get mine ready and my difficult questions.
I love it.
Break a leg, Alkesh. I'll see you there for sure.
Thanks, Lisa, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Awesome. It's awesome to always be running these with my partner in crime, Chantal. So thank you very much as ever, and thank you everybody for coming, and see you all hopefully either next Tuesday or at the next one on psychological safety. See you guys all soon.
Thanks, Lisa. Chantal.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Great stuff. Great,
guys.
Lisa. Nice tulips, Lisa.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.